This is Andrew, and this is Keen On, the daily now.tv chat show with some of the world's leading thinkers and writers. Hello, everybody. It is Tuesday, August the 22nd, 2023. As always, I'm talking to you from San Francisco on the edge of Silicon Valley. There's an interesting debate brewing in Silicon Valley about the merits of big technology. Late yesterday afternoon, I had Benan Tabrizi on the show. He lives just by the Stanford campus in Palo Alto. He's an executive coach and thinker and futurist. He has a new book out, Going on Offense, a leader's playbook for perpetual innovation. And he argues that big tech needs to continually innovate. He sees big tech, responsible big tech, as being a good thing. In particular, the Microsoft CEO, Satya Nadella, who is winning big tech's AI war, he sees as a model for responsible and smart corporate leadership. And Nadella has become the pinup, I think, of the tech press recently, ironically enough, in a post-Steve Jobs, Bill Gates world. And now the question is whether Microsoft can hold its AI lead and its massive investment in OpenAI. Certainly, big tech is increasingly powerful. The Wall Street Journal notes that whilst maybe its growth slows, its market dominance endures. And last week, there was an interesting piece in Foreign Affairs, co-written by Ian Bremmer, old friend of mine. He's been on the show, suggesting that in our AI-powered world, big tech companies need a seat at the table of the great powers. But not everyone, I think, is in the big tech camp. There are those who are still deeply fearful of big tech and its impact on our rights, our economy, and our democracy. And one of those men is Tom Kemp. He, like Benan Tabrizi, is a Silicon Valley guy. He's talking to us from Menlo Park, and his new book, Containing Big Tech, is out today. Tom, congratulations on the new book. How would you respond to people like Ian Bremmer and perhaps Benan Tabrizi, who simply acknowledge the reality of big tech's power and suggest that we need to learn to live with it, and half admire men like Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft, who clearly are doing their best to innovate their companies?
Well, speaking as a Silicon Valley person, I mean, clearly right now we have dead zones when it comes to markets that venture capitalists and entrepreneurs are just going to avoid. And I don't think, and these are huge markets, right? Mobile operating systems, search, e-commerce, the list goes on. And I don't think it's healthy for our economy or society to have such concentration of power. I mean, look, when AT&T was broken up, we had a flourish of innovations in telecommunication. When Microsoft was told to stop bundling and requiring Internet Explorer to be on every Windows machine, it opened up the internet revolution. So I actually think that the problems that we have today of overcollection of our data, some of the issues that we're going to face with AI just become exacerbated because of the large tech monopolies. And of course, I just don't think it's just healthy that we have these no-fly zones in huge swaths of our economy that startups just have to avoid.
You say that you're speaking as a Silicon Valley person. What exactly does that mean? What do you mean by that?
Well, I've been in the Valley for, 30 years. And so I've raised, I co-founded a company that went public. I founded another company most recently that was acquired by a large PE firm, Thoma Bravo, that was in the cybersecurity space. Raised venture capital. The last company raised $90 million in VC money from some of the top VCs like Excel, Index, Mayfield. And right now I'm an active angel investor in over 15 companies. And what I've done is I've taken my knowledge of the of Silicon Valley, and started doing a lot more advocacy work. And here in California, I worked on Proposition 24, which is the California Privacy Rights Act of 2020 that passed. And right now, I've actually written some legislation that is winding its way through the California legislature. That's the California Delete Act of SB. That's Senate Bill 362. So that's my experience, and I've had the opportunity to kind of observe the good, the bad, the ugly of what's been happening here in Silicon Valley. And there's a lot of strengths to these tech companies, and they've added a lot to our society. But I think it's foolish just to say, just let it be, because we do have some serious problems with for example, the weaponization of all this data that's being collected.
You say that you're a Silicon Valley person, but as a Silicon Valley person, wouldn't you recognize, as a startup entrepreneur, a successful startup entrepreneur, now a guy behind Kemp Ventures, that Silicon Valley, the nature of Silicon Valley is you have a small group of companies who win, and then you have investors like yourself who fund new companies, who challenge them, just as Google challenged Microsoft, and Microsoft challenged IBM, and IBM challenged those bundle of AT&T companies. It's just the nature of things. Why is anything different in 2023?
Startups are not challenging the big tech companies in their core markets. They're not getting any funding. Like, I don't know if you talked about the last one, Neva, in the search space, incredible technology. It failed, right? So people are funding on the periphery. Even VCs most recently were doing highly speculative crypto stuff, right? And so look, the reality.
But I take your point, but hundreds of millions, billions of dollars have been poured into the search space over the last 20 years since the arrival of Google dominating it. It's not Google's fault that no one's come up with a competitor. I mean, DuckDuckGo got massive funding. It's still a marginal company.
Yeah, but they're, I mean, if you look at the antitrust case that's coming up, that they're actually, they have anti-competitive practices. Like, take ad tech. Google is the pitcher, the catcher, the umpire in advertising technology. They take 50% of the revenue right there, and it's so awash in fraud, it's ridiculous, right?
So are you suggesting that Google is a fraudulent company?
I think everyone will agree that fraud in advertising, online advertising, is huge, that it's so difficult to actually figure out where you're not told where your ads are being placed, right? I mean, that's the fact. It's very difficult. There's been a set of recent studies by this company called Analytics that has actually documented the extent to which people don't have visibility in terms of where their advertising dollars are going. It's just kind of a trust.
But that's got nothing to do with big tech. I mean, that's just a rather rotten sector which Google
but they own the market.
Dominate.
I mean, they own. I mean, here's the problem. Okay. Right, which is, in the case of Google, they also pay $45-50 billion to Apple and other people to be the default search engine. That's the whole genesis of the antitrust case that's against Google specific to search. There's another antitrust lawsuit filed in their ad tech with 20 plus states. Amazon is likely going to face a very large antitrust lawsuit as well. But look, let's take a look at mobile operating systems, right? Do you think it's cool that if I try to come up with a startup that sells a mobile app, that I have to pay 30% to either Google or Apple just right off the bat? And if I try to do transactions within my mobile app, that I have to use their actual transaction system, their payment system, and I have to pay 30%. In a normal market, right, the transactions fees are a couple percent. Or take another example, that they participate in the same marketplaces that they're in, right? And so that gives them the opportunity, like in Amazon, to see what's being procured within their marketplace, and they can come out with knockups of that, Amazon Basics, or they can self-preference their own application. So I fundamentally believe, and historically, this has been the case in the United States, when you go back to the railroads, you go back to Standard Oil, that people that provide a marketplace shouldn't also participate in the marketplace. And so it is painful for startups that if they have to pay that 30% tax for transactions or just even sell their apps online. And then increasingly with Amazon, that people have to pay so much to Amazon, and they run the risk that Amazon turns around and copies. So I think we just have a completely unhealthy system here, and exasperates the problems that we.
It may be true, and I'm not sure I would necessarily disagree with some of the things you're saying, but isn't the fixed markets, just as in the 90s, you would have made the same argument about Microsoft, then you had Google and the Web 2.0 revolution that changed everything.
But what happened? There was an antitrust case that actually told Microsoft that you can't force the bundling. And so it was actually antitrust that put the pressure on, and Microsoft was faced with being split in two. Finally, they agreed to not require bundling and then open up the revolution. Go back to AT&T, right? Everything was AT&T in the 50s and 60s, and finally we had this telecommunications revolution because it was broken up. So there was actually antitrust actually enforced, and the last major antitrust case in the United States was with Microsoft, right? And so what we've had is with the big tech companies is two things. They've been completely unregulated in terms of the data collection, and there has been zero antitrust up till just recently, with Chair Lena Khan being put in place with the FTC. So that is no problems with creating great big technology companies, but at some point, if you get too big to care about your customers and you start choking things off, then we should actually start taking a closer look at their privacy practices and their surveillance practices, as well as their competitive practices.
So is your fix mostly, and I know you focus on this in the book, is your fix mostly a regulatory one? Lena Khan has had a lot of pushback inside and outside DC to some of her antitrust initiatives and her observations about the cartel-like behavior of these big tech companies, which you've talked about. Is the fix mostly regulatory, in your view?
Well, I think it first starts with education. And one of the reasons why I wrote this book containing big tech was to actually give a document to a layperson who has some concerns about, hey, is my privacy being invaded? What's this identity theft stuff? What's a data broker? What's AI, et cetera? And just try to walk them through and connect the dots in terms of, you'll find that most Americans, like you and I know this to be the fact because we're here in Silicon Valley, but most Americans actually don't realize that the business model of Meta and Google is advertising. You're not the customer. The customer is the actual advertiser, and that's what motivates them to do.
So what do you think they think the business model is of Google and Facebook?
Selling products.
How do they think they make money?
They don't. If you really actually, maybe if you spend a few minutes actually talking to them and they're like, oh yeah, they serve ads, but then they don't realize how they go about serving ads, which is actually unfettered collection of your information. And then you start asking them, is it cool that they're collecting all this information on minors, for example, right? Because there's really no differentiation between the collection of our behavioral information for adults or minors. And then you start asking them, like, well, do you understand that they use artificial intelligence to personalize everything, and that they actually have a digital voodoo doll of you that then influences you and pushes you in certain directions, and that's why you only see certain news feeds or videos, et cetera, and it helps shape and influence, but it's doing that to keep your eyes on the screen.
Are these big tech companies, Tom, are they all equally bad? I mean, Apple, if Tim Cook was on the show, he might agree with a lot of what you're arguing. He is the CEO of the biggest tech company of them all, a $3 billion company, but they're not really that involved in this advertising ecosystem, nor is Microsoft. Google and Facebook are, of course, and in some ways Amazon. Are you suggesting that all big tech companies are as bad as each other, or are you singling out companies like Google and Facebook?
I mean, Probably because the first part of the book has to do with digital surveillance and the overcollection of our data that has increasingly led to weaponization of our data, especially in a post Roe v. Wade world. And I did research in the book that Google promised that it wouldn't collect abortion-related searches and people going to abortion clinics, and I proved that that wasn't the case. So as it relates to digital surveillance, clearly,
what do you mean you proved that wasn't the case?
I actually did experiments, and actually found that Google, even though it made claims that it would discard this information about abortion-related searches, people actually driving and visiting abortion clinics, that was not true. And then that actually research was picked up by The Guardian late last year. That was based on my research. And then a couple months ago, Jeffrey Fowler in the Washington Post published an article that it was still happening as well. So they make promises and claims about their data collection, and they promised that they would not collect information regarding reproductive rights information, and they did, right? And it's been found out that Metapixel has been collecting sensitive information from websites regarding reproductive health and other things that are covered by HIPAA, FERPA, the list goes on as well. So yes, I would say Google and Meta are the worst when it comes to digital surveillance. My issue that I have with Apple is more on the competition side of things, the 30% charge, the self-preferencing of their own apps. And so I think they do not provide the ability for people to kind of more fairly compete in that space.
Well, we are talking with Tom Kemp, who's the author of an interesting new book, Containing Big Tech, How to Protect Our Civil Rights, Economy, and Democracy. It's particularly interesting because he is based in Silicon Valley. He is in Menlo Park, and he's an investor and a tech entrepreneur in his own right. We're going to take a short break. Now, Tom, we're going to talk very briefly about our sponsor, Liberty's Quarterly, a journal of culture and politics. I'm going to run a short ad. And then we'll be back to talk more about the dangers of big tech and how to fix it. So don't go away, anyone. We'll be back in about 2 seconds.
Beyond the news, the noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas. It's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought. A quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
And you can check out more about Liberties at libertiesjournal.com, and you can even subscribe to that. Well worth it. We are talking with my guest today, Tom Kemp. He's the author of a new book. It's out today, Containing Big Tech. Tom, this stuff really divides people. There are those who believe that, and I'm quoting from a piece in Fortune from a few months ago, Silicon Valley's hubris nearly ruined the US economy, whereas others believe, like in The Hill, that for better or worse, big tech remains the core motor of American innovation. Where do you stand in terms of the competitiveness of the American economy? Is big tech good or bad for the American economy?
I think overall it's very positive. I think, again, at some point when you reach certain companies reach a certain stage that they stop innovation, they lock out competitors, and that's where the regulators need to step in. Unfortunately, across the board in the United States, most of our major industries has been consolidated to 1 to 2 players, and that's not healthy.
But when we think of AI, which is clearly, some people are very fearful of it, some people see it as an existential risk to the species, but it's clearly enormously innovative. Microsoft is funding that indirectly through its investment in OpenAI. Google came up with the original idea of generative AI from one of their research groups, and now is leading it as well. So why aren't these big companies innovating? Seems to me as if they are. And Facebook and Amazon and Apple, they're all investing tens of billions, probably hundreds of billions of dollars in AI.
They are, but the the core markets that they participate in right now, that there isn't that much investment in other entities in those. And they do have a unique and distinct advantage in AI because they have all the data and they have all the compute power. And so we run the risk that their monopoly positions that they have in approximately 10 digital markets, will then continue and expand into AI. And so everyone that wants to do AI.
Could you talk about these 10 markets? Because they seem to be, over this conversation, they're growing. I mean, what?
Well, okay. I mean, the House committee identified 10 markets. And so I've talked about search, I talked about mobile operating systems, I talked about mobile application stores, talk about e-commerce. And so you can just kind of go down the list right there. The same markets are the ones that Europe has identified with the Digital Markets Act. So it's pretty commonly accepted with regulators that these are the markets that either are monopolies or duopolies with the big tech companies.
There's a big difference between a monopoly and a duopoly, isn't there?
Of course there is, but if they have the same pricing in terms of 30% cut for applications on the App Store, and that they force you to actually use and go through the mobile App Store, and they force you to go through their payment systems, then it's basically the same, right? I mean,
I'm guessing, Tom, if there was a rep of big tech here, they might say something like, well, you may be right in terms of investing in AI, but it's not our fault that you require tens of billions of dollars to actually play the game. That's just the nature of this new market. It's very different from starting a website or a search engine or an e-commerce store back in the 90s.
Well, I'm definitely have not proposed anything as it relates to antitrust or I haven't brought up any regulation specific to AI. I'm just talking about in the pre-existing markets where it's not competitive, right? And so, yes, we definitely want to, at some point in a market evolution, that it gets to the point where you have companies that have become too big to fail or too big to care, et cetera. And historically in the tech industry, we've just said, hey, let it happen, Hakuna Matata, et cetera. But I think it's fundamentally unhealthy, the fact that the data collection is unregulated. We do not have a federal privacy law. And now people are talking about let's put some laws in place to put guardrails with AI, but our information and data is not actually protected at the federal level, and the word privacy is not mentioned in the Constitution. Thankfully, here in California, we do have privacy in the Constitution. We do have the nation's most comprehensive privacy law, which I worked on, and I'm trying to embrace and extend that with some additional legislation. But the reality is that the vast part of the United States is not covered by a privacy law. So it kind of first starts with the data and giving people basic rights to say no, to know what's being collected, the right to say deletion. Otherwise, this is all going to be put into the blender of AI. And I think people are complaining about from a copyright perspective, but what about my PII? Should I not have rights not to have my PII be utilized?
What's your PII?
My genetic information, my face, my biological information. I mean, things that the definition of PII is things that uniquely identify me.
Do you think the Europeans, who are heavily regulatory when it comes to big tech, they certainly haven't stimulated any successful or many successful companies of their own? Do you
actually, I disagree.
Do you present the European model as a better one than the US?
No. I mean, look, I've actually, of the 15 or so investments, 4 or 5 of them are in Europe, and there's a very healthy ecosystem in France, in the UK, in Eastern Europe. There's a lot of activity, and now we actually see venture capital, getting closer to what we see in certain parts of the United States as well. So there is a healthy ecosystem. I don't think it was because of the regulatory issues. It was more just like the ecosystem of investors, et cetera. But there is I think in France, there's now like 20, 30, unicorns out there as well. So, I mean, people just say, oh, you associate, well, they have regulations and blah, 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 blah. No, that's not true. It was like the blocking and tackling that made Silicon Valley successful did not exist in Europe until recently. The issue that I have with Europe is that they've done a crappy job of enforcement, and all the big tech companies go to Ireland and have their cases done in Ireland, and there's a lot of pressure on the Irish DPC because they're like, oh crap, Meta is one of our biggest employers as well. So if anything, the enforcement has sucked in Europe. And now what they're doing with some of their newer laws, the DMA and DSA, is they're actually consolidating enforcement centrally, as opposed to the big tech companies shopping around to what country that they can fight a privacy violation and kind of working the refs in a small country like Ireland. And so that's the issue. But the reality is that, look, we don't have any guardrails for our data being collected, right? And so the last privacy laws that we had were like Graham Leach Bliley and HIPAA. That was pre-iPhone, right? Pre-Meta, et cetera. And now we've got all our healthcare information on these personal apps. Like, shouldn't we actually have something? I don't think that's too radical for me to say that our healthcare information shouldn't be just simply bought and sold, willy-nilly.
Right, and I'm not sure how that is connected with big tech, because with or without big tech, you're still going to have privacy issues. What about Section 230, Tom? Do you have strong feelings on that? Some people see
big tech provides the ad tech system, which this whole thing is facilitated from and through. So that they're like the sharks, and yes, there are remoras like data brokers in this actual system. And the fundamental issue is that people are hooked on behavioral data. And I'm not opposed to using behavioral data, but I am opposed to the use of sensitive personal information like your health care, like your biometrics. And I'm also opposed to the use of behavioral data to facilitate targeting of children. So I do think that, so that's where I'm not saying throw out surveillance-based advertising or behavioral-based advertising and replace it purely with contextual advertising. I'm saying there probably shouldn't be certain types of data that's used. Now, specific to Section 230, I'm very supportive of it. It's a lot of people call it the Magna Carta of the internet. The issue is that there is no way for people to object and say, I see something illegal here. I need to complain. And it just goes into a black box. So I do think that there should be some requirements placed on the larger tech providers, like we see with the Digital Services Act, where they actually have to respond to actual issues that are flagged by groups that have been certified that can funnel through issues. So we do have problems with counterfeit goods on the internet. We do have issues with illegal things being bought and sold. There should be a way to flag it. And then lastly, there should be a way for researchers to be able to access and see what type of ads are flowing through, et cetera, so they can actually provide some oversight and guidance to the algorithms that are, personalizing this advertising towards us.
Yeah, and I don't think a lot of people would disagree. It's just not entirely clear how that necessarily relates to big tech. Even if you've got small tech ad companies, you have the same issue. What about the issue, of course, that the gorilla in the room here, Tom, is the threat of China. We talked about Europe. Europe is a regulatory threat, I guess, to big tech, but not an economic one, whereas China now has some of the largest tech companies in the world. More and more people believe, including, it seems, both the Democratic current administration and the previous Republican administration, that we live in a zero-sum economic game, and that any gains for Chinese big tech is a loss for American tech. What about the China card, or the China question, and the argument? Well, if you control big American tech, if you regulate it, if you break it up, then it's not going to be American startups that benefit. It will be large Chinese companies that work outside the American regulatory system.
Oh boy, where to start right there? So I think you just have to step back and say, should people have some basic rights about what's being collected about them? and how that data is being used, especially if there's sensitive personal information that identifies them. And so, the funny thing is, people are like, oh my God, look at TikTok. And TikTok is basically doing the same thing that the other guys are doing as well, which is collecting all these microsignals about us, et cetera. And so we should have the equivalent of food nutrition labels, and we should have some basic rights to know what's being collected and have the right to say no and have the right to delete and correct, et cetera. I mean, so that's what I'm calling for. It's nothing revolutionary. It's a basic Bill of Rights as it relates to our data, right? And we have that in California, but why don't we have that at the federal level as well, right? So I don't think this is like, so onerous, right? In terms of what our ask and what our expectations are as well, right? And then specifically, as it relates to newer markets, I'm certainly not proposing any significant regulatory or antitrust activity because no one has reached critical mass. But I do think that for the health of the actual economy, that there are certain market segments that probably need to be more closely looked at, and which includes, for example, the ad tech market, where you have a situation where Google takes 50% of all the ad tech dollars that flows through them, and they support the publishers, the advertisers, and they provide the bidding system. And that's kind of weird.
Yeah, I mean, you keep on repeating that, and
yeah,
it's a critique of Google, but not necessarily of big tech. It's the one part of the economy that a lot of people are critical of, but I'm still not entirely clear. I mean, you haven't mentioned Microsoft. Should Microsoft be controlled? Are you not an admirer of Nadella and what he's doing there?
No, I'm actually.
Where should Microsoft be controlled?
No,
it seems like you're focusing exclusively on Facebook and Google.
Well, I think that, I mean, if I were to kind of stack rank things, so I mean, Google and Facebook, because they combine the digital surveillance business model with being a monopolist or duopolist, I think they definitely kind of rate higher. I think the issue I have with Amazon and Apple, which will come to fruition in antitrust lawsuits, is that their marketplaces are not competitive. And in the case of Microsoft, they do have some practices as it relates to digital surveillance. They have been.
Well, you say their marketplace. Let's take Amazon. Their marketplaces aren't competitive. We've done lots of shows on Walmart. They're certainly an alternative. If you don't want to buy on Amazon, you don't have to. You can buy on Walmart, and there are lots of independent online e-commerce stores. So why do they have a monopoly?
Okay. All right. So how many? Okay. All right. So it is basically required that most people actually have to be on Amazon, because that's the expectation that has been built up with consumers, that the product is there on Amazon. And once you're on Amazon, that you're in a situation in which you have to kind of pay to play, right? Where
you mean as a seller or as a buyer?
As a seller, right? As a seller, it is a pay to play where for you.
And that's different from Walmart.com.
But it's the dominance. If it's the core market dominance in the actual marketplaces, et cetera, that Amazon, has for U.S. e-commerce, has a dominant market role. And the issue is with the sellers right there, that you have to basically pay to play, because otherwise, if you don't pay to play, that you will not show up in the top search results. Furthermore, Amazon sits there, looks at what's being actually sold, and and you've done all this research as a seller to come out with a hot product, say dog beds, and all of a sudden Amazon sees that there's a lot of dog beds being sold, they come out with their version, an Amazon Basics dog bed right there. And so that's fundamentally not fair to actually provide the marketplace, but also participate in the marketplace and be able to preference right there. So it's unfortunately, that is the scenario that a lot of sellers find themselves. I think if you ask the average seller on Amazon, they're not happy by the increasing.
And what about the average buyer? I mean, no one's forced to go to Amazon, then go somewhere else.
Yeah, well, but unfortunately, this is the way it is. Just like maybe 100 years ago, that the only gas would there be an alternative standard oil for gas? Maybe if you drove 100 miles, right?
But you don't
Same
have
thing
to
with the
drive 100
railways.
miles. It takes you a second to click on Walmart.com or another e-commerce store. So
Yeah,
it's
but
entirely different.
Yeah, well, I just fundamentally disagree. It's that there is anti-competitive practices, and it's going to be seen through with a set
What about
of
the politics
lawsuits.
of all this, Tom? It seems increasingly that big tech has become the evil that unites, an appropriate, low-hanging, convenient punch bag, both for the left and the right in America. I'm not sure where you are politically, but certainly the right-wing media seems to hate big tech increasingly and see it as the problem. All these features on Fox News about Biden being in bed with big tech. DeSantis is calling for Google to be broken up. Is there a danger that big tech will become a casualty of populist politics?
No, I think the reality is that, yeah, there's a lot of, both sides are kind of kicking it, but I think there is common agreement as it relates to certain core things. For example, there is a bill called the Kids Online Safety Act, right, which is bipartisan in nature. There's the Fourth Amendment is not for sale act. So there is common ground on certain core things.
But coming back, but you again, you're moving the argument around. I mean, there are lots of small sites from Reddit onwards that are maybe not so small, but certainly not big tech companies that are dangerous perhaps for online users. That's got nothing to do with big tech. And in fact, some of the big tech platforms from YouTube to Threads to Facebook, they're very carefully policed.
Okay, sure. If that's what you think. Yeah. I mean, look, there's been numerous studies about disinformation on YouTube. The fact is that these groups have cut their safety, and there was a lot of issues stemming from the 2016 election as it relates to this. And frankly, if you look at the Facebook files in terms of what's going on with Instagram and with kids, et cetera. I'm just simply saying that we have a unregulated situation here, and there could be a prioritization of what data is collected and who's being protected. It's like, don't collect sensitive information and prioritize kids' safety. And in markets where there is too much consolidation, that it's unfair, in terms of preferencing, et cetera, that maybe we should look at, participation, in a marketplace that is run by the owners of the marketplace. And so that's kind of my main thesis right here, is that there can be more being done without actually, I'm not saying kill big tech. I'm saying, hey, we should, contain it in terms of,
But that sounds like the old Soviet. You remember containment when it came to the Russians during the Cold War? You calling for a kind of Cold War containing?
No. It's in the book. It's analogy about like a star. You can't stop him. You hope to contain him. So that was the.
So it's
the
George
analogy.
Kennan 2.0.
No, it's more of a ESPN sports announcer analogy, which I bring forth right there. But look, the reality is that great companies in Silicon Valley, it's hard to compete with them, and there have been some very documented issues as it relates to civil rights. And I think in a post-Dobbs world, it's going to get even more significant if we don't do something in terms of providing some basic privacy rights and look at the competition issue.
Right. Well, we haven't really talked about Dobbs, and you keep on falling back on that. Maybe another issue, maybe another book. But finally, Tom, you've also mentioned California, which is interesting. Gavin Newsom's been on my show several times in the past. Is California the model? You've talked about some local initiatives, particularly given the seeming paralysis of federal government when it comes to regulation of one kind or another. Should California be the model for other states too? Are they doing a good job?
Well, California has historically been the model when it comes to consumer protection. It started in the automobile industry and with automobile emissions, as well as car safety, et cetera. So it's commonly known as the California effect. And frankly, I would take the California model as opposed to maybe the Brussels effect that, with some of the concerns and valid concerns that you raised about Europe as well. So in California, we did come out with the nation's first comprehensive privacy law. And California, actually in the early 1970s, it was voted on and we as a proposition, and we added to our Constitution in 1972 that privacy is an inalienable right. And so if you read the actual proposition back in 1972, it was very amazing that they thought about some of the concerns and issues that we face today. So I think California provides the right kind of ecosystem, and there has been some good laws passed. And last year, there was the age-appropriate design code, where it basically says, hey, if you're building products for kids, right, that you probably need to change their design, just like you have different designs for kids in the physical world, that you should do it in the digital world as well. So look, I'm an entrepreneur. I've built companies. I've raised money. I've taken a company public. I got a company acquired, et cetera. And so I'm very pro Silicon Valley, pro innovation, et cetera. But when it comes to these things, it's quite obvious that things are not working out as well as they could and should. And just handing things over to a couple of large tech companies and just saying, trust me, may not be the best thing. And maybe we need a little bit more rights, for all Americans as it relates to our data.